Hi everyone, welcome to the Reading into Culture podcast. My name's Zara.
I'm Chris.
And we are joined today by Nithya, who wrote the wonderful poem The Witness. And we're here to talk to her about her story as a writer and about how this poem came together and about the poem itself, of course. Okay, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So thanks a lot for inviting me to this podcast. I think it's very lovely to talk about your own work. And my name is Nithya. I'm from Chennai in India, and I'm a poet. I work in the sustainability field, so I'm kind of inspired by that aspect of my life as well. And I'm really just grateful to see that my poem, The Witness, has gotten a nice place for readers to visit and engage with. So thanks a lot for that.
Amazing. Yeah, no, that's I think it's a really remarkably good poem. I'm really excited to discussing it with you. So before we begin, would you like to say a little bit about the poem? So what's kind of generally the background and maybe the influences of the poem, just a kind of a little introduction of the poem, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So The Witness was written in response to a prompt that I saw on a literary magazine called Osawa Literary Review. I'm also a reader for that magazine, and I found an impulse to write about it. An interesting part about this poem is the stimulus of this poem started maybe even more than a decade ago. So it's inspired by an incident that happened. Most of my poetry comes from lived experience because I'm probably an infant in the poetry world. I began writing about a year ago, and I engage with poetry quite differently as an editor for some of my friends, and as a reviewer, and now as a as a creator or as a poet. So I found that this topic was very interesting because you're essentially actively or passively, as a human being, witnessing the world around you. You absorb things. If there is an element of curiosity in you, you would definitely turn it into a piece of writing. So that's how it started, and it's also my first attempt at a concrete poem. And I kind of, you're always kind of extra in love with your first baby, if I may say so. So, so I found that I was very attached to this work. Um, and this began, um, as a response, um, and I find that when you start writing about something, you'll notice a lot of themes which recur. So for me, it was this almost epigenetic quality. So I kept writing about family, about inherited qualities and how it affects and gets transmitted from a generation to another. So this is a product of that. And I was a bit attached. I'm not sure because I listen to other poets who are kind of I don't know. I think each poet has a very different relationship with their poem. Some are very critical. I find that I'm mostly critical about everything, with the exception of this one. So I was stoked to truly see it, find a place. So here's The Witness. You notice her slogging, body worn by years of care. She looks like her mother now. You look like your father, with his likeness and afflictions. Born with beautiful eyes, you see the words, the spaces between them, the lips, the gulps of lying throats, a naturalized soothsayer. Your brain is wine, older than the grape it was born from. The vintners like you. Time's done its cruel thing. It is, and it has, the weight of three people and a saint. their deeds and memories lining your womb. So you decide to cull it gently. The best way to be is not. There will be no witnesses to this story.
It's amazing.
That's powerful stuff.
I'm really, really surprised to hear that you've only been writing for a year and then this is your first attempt at anything. I'm very surprised. This is very good, very good place to be after a year.
Yeah, it was very accomplished, and yeah, I guess it goes to show that like, some people come to poetry later in life, and that's amazing, and it doesn't, it's amazing. I don't know, people have different perspectives on things. It's great like that. So yeah, what really strikes me about this poem is obviously this idea of the witness, right? I just was thinking like this use of the kind of the second person pronoun with this idea of witnessing creates such a kind of almost like a distance between the reader or listener and the speaker of the poem, and how that relates to this idea of witnessing, because to witness you and like it feels almost like the speaker is witnessing the reader almost. I don't know if that is, but this idea of this relationship between the second person pronoun and the speaker is something that and witnessing is something that I would like to explore. If anybody has any thoughts about that.
Yeah, sure. Now that I think about it, you might think that when you craft a poem, you get into the details of it.
Mm.
But this is one detail that came kind of naturally, and I didn't explore I think what is kind of defining it at this point. Since I'm very close to the subject, I'm just trying to get to the message of witnessing. I also find that poetry is a way of kind of indirectly hinting at certain things that might be too hard to just talk about.
Mm.
I think humans, we respond very well to analogies or some kind of metaphorical element or just a kind of juxtaposition, anything but the direct source, right? So that's kind of how it began. Although I am a bit conscious about telling about the poem, although I would love to do that as well. I feel there's a certain mystery where the readers can kind of insert themselves or their story, and that's the only reason why I'm a bit careful around my words. Uh, my intention around writing poetry is less about expressing myself and more about communicating. So I think I would be one of those people who love showing and telling, and permutations of those.
Yeah, sometimes you have to be careful because I feel like there's two different philosophies about poetry. One is kind of more popular now about poetry is like therapy, and it's only really about what it does to the person who writes it, and there's less attention paid to what does it do to the person who reads it. And so I think it's a good instinct to kind of keep that secret for yourself so you can actually let the reader experience the poem how it is, and you will know all the places that they came from, or maybe not, but often there's certain places that things come from and you are aware of them, so the mystery is kind of gone, and for the reader it's still kind of there. And I think it's nice to to really think about, okay, what does this actually communicate to the reader, and to think with to write with the reader in mind, rather than just what the experience of writing the poem does to the writer, which is, as I said, probably the more popular kind of approach. What do you think? Who is the poem for? Is it for the reader or is it for the writer? Or rather, what does the poem do to the reader versus the writer?
I think people write as a form of expression, quite simply, and to sort of process things that have either happened to them or things that you see around your world. And there are different motivations for people to write. And what I imagine is there's this beautiful movie called Soul,
Mm.
where the titular character goes to another state, like a trance-like state when he's practicing his craft. So I think it's also a high without taking any substances, if I may say so. I think that's the experience of writing, and also you consume the world in a very different way.
Mm.
I'm reminded of this poem by Arya Aber, where she says, "My eye is a slow thief, it stops for so little." And I think that's how poets think, like, once everything becomes, a generative prompt around the world, and you just interact with the world a bit differently. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's sort of the poet's point of view.
Mm.
Uh, and when we look at readers, poets are inevitably readers as well. And I think, again, it sends you to another place, but this time the world is constructed by the poet. And I think it's these new neural connections that you make, that really sparks your curiosity and you feel like a sudden burst of life and energy. I think that's why people read, and there's an addictive quality to poetry, which one can know only when you're like in the middle of it and you find that you're buying books every day and yeah, and you're reading, and then suddenly you find that you're always reaching for poetry and your world is filled with it.
Mm.
Mm. I totally agree. That's very interesting. I think it's interesting that you say about the eye. You mentioned that quote about the eye, because the eye is very much present in this poem. If you see with born with beautiful eyes, and well, how does this? It seems almost like this nature of witnessing the world is for you a kind of fundamental part of the poetic process. And I just wonder if this kind of relationship between witnessing and looking at the world, is that this one and the same thing for you, or is there some kind of nuance there?
Yeah, well, I think you could experience the world through any sense, actually, not
Mm-hmm.
just the visual component. It could be through listening, it could be, through touch. There are some tactile experiences that kind of leave an impression on your mind. And I find that poets often want to recreate those in on the page. So I
Mm-hmm.
feel writing is also a very sensory process, although we think it's just solitary and there's a person in front of their laptop or their typewriter furiously typing or writing. But I think it's a very sensorial experience.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. I agree. I agree. I think poetry is it's about it's in the ear, and also in the eye. You hear it in your head and you see it on the page, and so it's very sensory, much more sensory than say prose. I would say, which is much more kind of intellectual because you don't how it looks and how it sounds aren't really important. But with poetry, how it looks and sounds are such fundamental building blocks of it that it has this kind of sensory element. And then at the end they say there will be no witnesses to this story. So because you don't have to witness something visually, you can witness something with other senses. Is that a kind of a strangely anti-poetic statement, perhaps a kind of statement of a lack of poetic capability or a lack of poetic potential? Because if poetry is a kind of this retelling of an experience, if there is no witnessing of that experience, where does that leave the kind of
Mhm.
poetic process?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you interpreted it in this manner. Um, while I'll try to not not tell more, I find that essentially, and I feel when people go through difficult times in their life, through traumatic experiences, I think something changes in you fundamentally. And there's always a component of shame involved, or a shame, or certain kind of really strong feelings where you just want to curl up and you don't want anyone to witness that part of your life. And what I've tried to do with this poem is essentially I'm talking about um, autoimmune diseases. So I felt that it's something, and mental health. So it's something that kind of travels through generations. And you, as an entity, as a body, as a human, are a witness to several generations before. So that was kind of the message. And I did feel at 12 or 13, um, at the risk of sharing too much, but I think it's essential to kind of understand the poem. Um, I have been living with an autoimmune condition called lichen planus. So it manifests in your body as, skin lesions. It's not a pretty sight. And as a young, like 12-year-old or something, I think I just learned genetics or something like that. And I could kind of map across my family these instances of, manifestations of diseases and mental health issues. And I remember going to the doctor once with my mom, and my mom expressed to the doctor that this, like my child doesn't want to have children. And when I think about it now, when I'm writing, it's really kind of dark that a child's mind went to that extent, because somehow I knew that I didn't want to put the next generation of my family into, any form of the topics that we just discussed. So that came from a place of anger, really. I think the tides have changed. Um, I understand family history is a bit better. I understand, even we have studies around autoimmune diseases and mental health, which kind of supports you to find meaning, right? Why did something happen to you? So, so this poem stemmed there. So it started about a decade and a half ago, and here it is. So that's kind of the genesis of the witness. So the witness is actually not even present. It's my child, or my unborn child. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That explains the afflictions of the father, because I was wondering about that, because there's the mother's body that is slogging and worn, and then there's the father with his likeness and afflictions, which in some way is a little bit more. It sounds a little more intact than the mother's body, but yeah, that's really interesting that the afflictions is kind of something that then also would be passed on. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I agree, and I definitely think this idea of witnessing is a kind of generational process. Definitely strongly comes across in the poem, and it kind of ends with the speaker and somehow deciding not to continue this kind of generational process of witnessing. So I think it very successfully communicates that idea to me.
There's something about kind of speaking as well. There's witnessing and seeing, but then there's also something about kind of, there's the lying throats, and then also you see the spaces between the words. So one is kind of a straight, a lie, so an untruth being said, and the other one is something not being said, but the child still kind of understands it. What do you think about this kind of the other side of witnessing, which is the kind of speaking and the kind of untruth being told or not told?
Yeah, I think it sort of stems from how our society, skirts around difficult topics, and we either try to camouflage it in some form, or completely, like how they say, if you tell a lie enough times, it starts seeming like the truth. So it was a commentary on how people around you react to your situation.
Mm.
Um, and there, if you don't understand something, you try to put some sense into it. I feel in India, we are not quite advanced or progressive when it comes to mental health or autoimmune things. We can be a bit um, insensitive around these things. So when you don't understand something, I think it produces a kind of, tension in the other person, and you want to fill it with, a version or a story of your own. So I guess that's what I was trying to show, that it's not just an individual act of witnessing. It's also a chain reaction that it begins.
Interesting.
That is really interesting. Because for me, when I hear the word witness, I can't help but think about that in a kind of legal sense, in a courtroom or something. And therefore, and in that situation, witnessing kind of has two sides, right? It has like an observation, but then it necessitates then a kind of speaking of that observation, a retelling. To be a witness, you need to both see it and then talk about it later. And so that's kind of this kind of union of the seeing and the speaking in this poem, this kind of social aspect of the poem. I think the word witness really brings that out. But there's something interesting about it. This kind of, the eyes are beautiful, but the throats are lying. There's a kind of the eye is somehow prioritized over the speaking. To observe is somehow that side of the witnessing equation is somehow beautiful, whereas the other side of the witnessing equation is dishonest. If that makes sense. Like, to see something is pure, but then to retell it, that introduces a kind of corruption.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about that.
So thanks a lot for this. Like, I am so happy you shared this, because it's like, I think a poet's dream, right? To invoke that feeling. And I love this interpretation, because it's so different from what I understood. And I love that the form allows you to really deduce so many things. Um, yeah, I do. I did write this from a point of uh, innocence and ignorance. So the innocent part is, when something happens to you before your time, especially when you're a child, and you're kind of dealing with things above your age or pay grade. And then there's ignorance, which can come out of anything really, lack of exposure or some kind of um, a cultural mindset, if that's the term. So I really love, I'm still kind of uh, reacting to your interpretation of
Yeah.
it, wherein you have an equation and one side seems very honest and the other one not so much. So
I have a kind of different thing I'd like to talk about in the poem, if you're
absolutely
happy to
absolutely.
move on. So there's something in this poem about nature, or about agriculture. So there's the wine and the grape and the vintners, and then there's also the culling. And especially with your background in sustainability, what do you think about that? It seems to kind of, the poem seems to view children as something something very natural, which of course it is, but it seems like having children is somehow the same as an animal population growing, and then also something like a grape growing and being turned into wine. What do you think?
yeah, I do work in sustainability in agriculture, so I think it kind of seeped into my poem. And the nature of wine is, as we know, it has a gestation period, a time to really mature. Um, and it could be a cliche as well, and it was just the way it was intended. I'm trying to recollect the part about culling. Culling was, I guess, you do connect it to some parts of perhaps livestock, but that was that was not intentional. So perhaps it's just my two worlds mixing in. But you very rightly pointed out the part about sometimes when you look at creatures other than human beings, there's some insects and birds who live only to reproduce. And when you see that evidence, in a sense, you kind of come to a conclusion that perhaps you're here to extend this species on Earth. For humans, it's very complicated. I think we are social, smart animals, and we do a lot of good, but I guess we destroy the planet a lot as well, compared to other creatures around the world who kind of have an equity, if you will, because they just take what's required and then deliver something back. But we do much more than the scope of what we were perhaps put in. So I feel eventually all poetry is existential in a way. Like you're trying to find out that meaning in some way or form.
Yeah, I think so we are in on the Rhine in Germany, and here they have a lot of wine agriculture is the word, viticulture. They have a lot of make a lot of wine here, all over the hills and everything. And part of that, right, is there's also a culling involved in that on the plant. Like you trim the plant down so you just have the strongest stem. So culling can also be a kind of, it's not just livestock, it is also plant agriculture, I think, and you can create stronger by culling, but it is also kind of destructive. So even aside from the world of agriculture, a cull is a kind of necessary destruction to produce strength somehow. I think that's very interesting, a kind of a gentle cull, as a way of describing the decision to not have children. I think I find very, very striking and powerful. I would like to perhaps move on and discuss the form of the poem. So how it is on the page. It's something kind of metatextual in the discussion of the spaces between the words for a poem that has so many spaces between its words. What is a space between a word? What lives there? I think could be an interesting question. Because on a piece of paper, it's just nothing, or is it nothing? But perhaps there's something else. There's something there that isn't so easy to see.
Yeah, thanks for that question, really. I think in concrete poems, it's that the spaces are intentional. And I think those are the best parts because sometimes when you read poetry, really good ones, as people say, you don't understand and you need to read it a couple of times. And when you intentionally ask the reader to pause and think, I think it gives them that breather to essentially fit in or think a little about what was going on in this poet's head. And they become a part of that um, image, really. So it's a very intentional thing to do. So we can, with good confidence, say that we, at this point, at this juncture, we need to decipher this. So it's kind of like a puzzle. I think people who love reading poetry also love unpacking, like a detective. Like, what did they want to do? Um, and and I have often wondered what these spaces mean when I first started reading poetry. And slowly I feel with the content, um, you know, blank spaces are blank spaces, but they aren't really. Because for each poem, that blank fills in, something very different. And I think when you're writing on a page, you have the creativity through words, images, and I really think your form is kind of the last way that you can be sort of creative, unlike in art where you have different materials. So here there's a kind of classic aspect to writing. Writing is words and text and paper. And I like how people choose to create concrete poems and make it more kind of indulgent.
Indulgent is a nice word. That's
I think could you explain for anybody who might not know what you mean by concrete poetry? I think that's something, and how you understand that technique.
So concrete poems or shape poems are the ones where the poet intentionally creates a shape out of it. And this shape is different from our regular, left aligned poems. For instance, the other day I read about coconuts, and the the poem was like a coconut with a straw in it. So I thought that was very, it was a bit funny at the same time. It kind of gives you an insight about it's very clear because we associate images, like we learn images quite fast and we can recognize those shapes and patterns. So this is at the funny end of the spectrum. And then there was another one, which I believe was maybe, the vagina. So when you look at it, you're kind of surprised by it, as you might expect a thing or two when you go into a museum, but not on a page. So I think it can be bold. It's on a spectrum, and um, it's a source of creativity as well.
there's definitely the I really like the beginning because it's kind of the mother on one side and the father on the other side, almost like a family tree, and then it kind of comes together in the middle. Um, and I think that works really, really well to have it also happen simultaneously, because you are simultaneously, you half come from your mom and half from your dad, so it's kind of not after one another, they happen at the same time, and I think that comes across really well.
I totally agree. And I think that the poem ends with three stanzas of kind of conventional left margin aligned poetry is a kind of the left margin is the mother and the right margin is the father and the middle is the child. The end is then the child adopting the role of a mother or potential mother, which is then rejected. Does this poem have a shape in the way that does it look like a coconut or a vagina? Is there some kind of physical thing being represented here?
I think you've interpreted it quite well. I did want to bring those. I couldn't plan like a figure, like a baby or something. That would be
That's the
very
next one.
difficult. And I'm not an artist, so but I wanted some distinguishing qualities, and I think we can achieve that through the separation and providing that I think white space. Um, and exactly like how you mentioned, I think your interpretation is very lovely, and I'm glad that it reaches in some way in the way it was intended. So I think you do need to, share a message in the same form, although your poem will always be interpreted in a different tone. You can't dictate that. But I'm very glad that, it resonated in the very same way in which it was written.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
Amazing.
I think I would like to ask about the line, "The weight of three people and the saint." I'm hesitant to ask a poet, what does it mean? But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And I'm also wondering how do I navigate this
Yes.
without already I think there's a lot being said, and I'm glad there's still some mystery that remains. Um, the part that I can certainly share is once you start writing, you see a theme that comes across, quite unintentionally and organically. That's the best part, I think. So the solutions, or rather characters or elements that come in this poem, there's an answer in another poem. So I think that's kind of, I'm very glad that naturally the it takes this shape. So the saint appears in another poem. Um, but one clue that I could give is it comes from a collection of poems that I'm currently calling as the theory of inheritance. So it does deal with um, the inherited forms and how, um, and also from a previous part of the conversation, the role of epigenetics and transference of certain trait. So it does play around with these themes. So I feel in what I hope would be a long journey of writing and publishing, that the readers will be able to place who the saint is, which according to me is very evident. But I guess I'm still at my very nascent stage. So for now, I think it might remain a mystery because that poem is not yet published.
Yeah, that's super interesting. What do you, as a reader, what do you make of that line? Not knowing anything about any of the poems.
Well, to me, there's something very kind of holy, religious. There's a religious aspect to the poem from something Christian. This idea of wine, this idea of a saint, and then a soothsayer is also a kind of mystical role. So there's very much, perhaps this is my European perspective, but there's something very, there is a kind of a kind of exploration of mystical Christian themes here somehow with the, and that's and then in Christianity as well, motherhood is such a central idea.
And three.
That's very true. That's very true. And three, good point. So there's a kind of, there's the way of a kind of mystical moral requirement. The kind of, I don't know, there's a kind of time is crushing you with all of the things that time is. And a saint is a kind of ancient, well, not necessarily ancient, but very often ancient, kind of mystical thing that has this kind of weight. I don't know. That's kind of maybe how I would approach that line without the necessary context.
Yeah, that is also interesting.
My mind is blown because I wouldn't have, there's another version of coconut which is me, because I feel like I'm brown on the outside and white on the inside. Um, it's sort of like, it's sort of true. So I did study in a convent, but I don't know if the influences go past, just I think it's just a deeper analysis. But I think it's very beautiful that you mentioned this. Um, I do feel a religion is such an important part, whether it exists in your life or not. And yeah, I'm so glad your mind went there, and thanks a lot for sharing, because I think that I'll take this back and I think the next time I read this poem, it's going to be a bit different, even though I just produced it. That's why I love that we have a space where you talk about things. Because writing is solitary, reading is also mostly solitary. I do have a question for you, which I feel readers would love to hear, which is, as an editor, you must be getting um, a lot of content, and whether it's essays or poetry, something. So how do you know that, or how do you select certain voices? Do you have some, criterias, or do you go just immerse into that, engage with that content or that piece of writing? How is it? Because I know that Reading into Culture is a very young magazine. I'm very happy to be a part of the early stages. So, if you could share a little bit, because I'm sure poets love to hear the other side, you know. Yeah.
That's very nice of you to ask us a question. That's very sweet. I don't think we have any kind of formal criteria, and it's actually funny because some people, often people go on the website and look up our names and stuff, which is very nice, and write it in the email and put a lot of thought into the email. Sometimes people write emails that are actually addressed to a completely different magazine and they just copy and pasted it, and it makes no difference. It makes no I don't think we base it on anything really other than if you're kind of struck by the piece. And can I actually find something real quick?
Of course.
Yes, I'd like to read this out because I bought this
Wow, okay.
book ages ago when I first got into poetry, and it has an introduction, and I didn't read the introduction, but there's a quote by Robert Frost in the very beginning, and I'd like to read that out because it really is so true, I think. It is absurd to think that the only way to tell if a poem is lasting is to wait and see if it lasts. The right reader of a good poem can tell the moment it strikes him that he has taken an immortal wound, that he will never get over it. That is to say, permanence in poetry, as in love, is perceived instantly. It hasn't to await the test of time. The proof of a poem is not that we have never forgotten it, but that we knew at sight we could never forget it. And I think that is so true. When you read something, you just know. Sometimes, obviously, we have, sometimes we accept things immediately. Sometimes we put it on like a maybe list, and then we have a short list and a long list, and then we kind of choose some in later stages and stuff. So, but most of the time you kind of, and that is only because we can only publish so many things, or we don't want to publish 100 pieces. We want to publish a reasonable amount, and that is the reason why. But yeah, I feel like you kind of can sense it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I do. There is a kind of, you do want to kind of, how much do you like it is obviously a very important question. Like, it's our magazine and we want it to reflect the things that we like.
Exactly. Yeah.
And hopefully other people will like them too. I would just say there is a kind of basic level of, about half of the submissions we can kind of reject straight away, not to sound cruel, but there's a certain basic level of competence, and about 50% of what we get, it kind of on some kind of doesn't meet a level of competence. So then there's the other half where there's interesting voices and what we want to prioritize and what we not want to prioritize, but some of the stuff is kind of not competent enough, essentially, that you kind of have to move on from it. It's with poetry especially, you want a kind of diversity of styles, diversity of voices, that kind of, because poetry is such a diverse form that you want a poem like this, which is more kind of concrete and about visuals. You want other poems that are I don't know, it's hard to describe, but there's so many different ways of writing poetry.
I don't take that into account very much. That's interesting to hear.
if there's two pieces that are really similar, I probably wouldn't want to publish two, or maybe two would be fine, but I wouldn't want to publish 3 or 4 concrete poems, because then it will be a bit, you want variety like that. But yeah, also it's just the kind of, it's looking for, when you're reading, hundreds of pieces, you really need something to stand out, something to kind of make this one stand out, because as much as you try to read everything really, really carefully and appreciate the strength of everything, sometimes it can all kind of start to blend into each other. So when I'm looking for something that has a freshness, has something interesting, has something compelling, and not even necessarily in the meaning, because it takes a few reads to really understand the meaning of a poem, but just in the technique, in the style, and this kind of ending is such a punch in the stomach. This kind of, there will be no witness to the story, is such an effective ending that this poem is so hard to forget and so hard to ignore. That I think it's very, very powerful indeed. And with prose, it's a slightly different. We do publish some flash fiction, short stories and stuff. That is more of a process of kind of that's a tricky one. There you can kind of get away a little bit more with just having a really good idea and not quite having the execution. But with poetry, it needs to kind of, the execution is much more important than the idea. But yeah, maybe we need to codify our process a bit more. That question is going off guard slightly. But
with the essays as well, I feel like there especially, it's like if the kind of topic is on your mind a few days after you read it, that's always a good sign. That you have the desire to talk about it, or be like, oh, have you read this piece yet? Like, read this so we can talk about it. I kind of feel like, and that's I guess there are 3 different kind of genres that we publish, and therefore 3 different kind of criteria.
Yeah, and with I think with the non-fiction pieces, there's also kind of new political ideas, new political or less publicized political perspectives is also important, like also global perspectives, because we get a lot of Americans. There was a lot of this time. There was a lot of poems about how Trump is bad. A lot of American, and there's a lot of things like that is also very good. But the American perspective is already so dominant in our culture that we try to not have too much America going on.
And we're not even Americans.
No,
so.
we're European. We don't have any Europeans actually. It's a few Indians.
Do we not this time?
No Europeans this time. Wow. We're not pushing any Europeans.
I think it's very interesting because so American pop culture is really popular. It's around the world. I think they have the most impact. Although there are so many lovely stories and creators and artists all over the world. So I think, to put it very simplistically, I feel like consuming one sort of media is like monocropping, So you just have the same thing, and what happens is it truly makes the soil less fertile. So I think and that's also what drew me to submit to your magazine, because I knew, and you're very clear. I think you write very less in the about section, but I think the message is supremely clear, where I knew that new voices would be appreciated. But sometimes you can find, maybe you're too ethnic, or perhaps your voice doesn't have a certain Irish quality to it, or there's just so many ways of being. And I kind of had the confidence even before interacting with you, just on the basis of your premise and your promise, really, that you would be digging more into culture, and it would be political and it would be left wing. So it's like, sign me up for this.
Oh, that's so nice.
No, I remember that in your email. I remember that being that was very charming. I thought. Amazing. I'm glad it's coming across that pleased me greatly to hear.
Yeah, and thank you for that question. That's very nice. Yeah. So, should we tackle the final question of the podcast?
Yeah, I think so.
So, we would like to talk about what place does writing, and maybe even particularly poetry, have in culture and in society right now?
Thanks a lot. I was ruminating about this question quite a bit. And I find that writing is a very gentle and non-violent form, but it can be an act of resistance, I think. That's why we find time and again that our voices are kind of curtailed or curbed. And I realize the power of words when I try to write something political. And after the creative surge, I kind of felt very scared. And I think that is a very clear marker of the times that we live in. I knew that if I published this, um, like poets, it's, I know perhaps there are very few people reading us, but the weight of the words was so immense that I felt that if it goes to the wrong pair of eyes or ears, then, in India, we do arrest our comedians, people who speak the truth, and all of that. And I thought it was a very strong indicator of the, kind of polar world that we live in. And I knew that if I don't have a kind of, subtle, cozy, and cute poetry out there, people will start taking me seriously, but for a different set of reasons. So I think it's very important to write, um, especially for the reason that now we have artificial intelligence, which in a way is challenging creativity. And perhaps for the first time in the history of humanity, we have more generated content by this entity, by artificial intelligence than humans, perhaps in LinkedIn or even other sources that we find. So I think it would be a way to demonstrate what humans do the best is being creative and creating art. So that's one perspective. When I thought about it a bit deeply, I realized that it's important to archive the time that you're living in. And I heard from a historian that Indians, we don't maintain journals. It's just not in our DNA, I guess. Some people do. It would be wrong to generalize, but historians don't take private accounts because they don't exist. I feel in the West, it's a bit more prominent where you have, events that you can mark with the diary or the journal of a person. I think it's very important to write truthfully and um, make it as widespread as possible so that you can kind of speak to another generation, even if you're not there. Because I feel um, it's like words and works are very fragile. Like it could, you're like one climate event away from losing everything. Uh, Sorry to be pessimistic, but I think that's the whole fragility of creating art, that it is not very permanent and it's just going to stay as a capsule of time. So I think it's very important to write, and it's important to write truthfully, and that's why I write, so that I can, in my very small way, uh, showcase a life that was lived.
That's lovely.
Yeah, wonderful answer.
Do you have an immediate response to that?
No, I just think that's very true and very profound. I think that is, writing is, as a technology, is the most effective technology we have for preserving something for hundreds or thousands of years. If you want something preserved for such a long time, writing is a much superior technology to audio recording or video or painting. These things simply don't preserve in the same way that writing does. And I guess in the case of some of them, they haven't really had the opportunity to. But writing is unique as an art form. Obviously, there were like cave paintings, and we do have some visual art from millennia ago. But generally, writing is the art form that is maintained. And I think there's something very true about that, something very profound about that.
I also think it's a very, very good point that you made about the kind of freedom of speech, especially when it comes to poetry, because obviously there's poetry and political poetry that just says what it thinks, like it just says it very straightforwardly, but most poetry is not that way, and it is, you have to interpret it, and you have to as the reader participate to create the meaning. And so it can be a kind of protection against kind of limits on the freedom of speech, because you're not saying anything directly, you're just kind of hinting at things or describing something and describing the mother's body and the eyes and the spaces between words. And if you really pay attention, you can pick up on what the poem is saying, but you have to pay attention, and the government probably isn't paying attention to that in that way. So that's a really good point, I thought.
That's very true. Poetry has has a very subversive quality, and I think that was. If you look at the Romantic poets, there was a time in England of great oppression after the French Revolution, and the Romantic poets managed to get around that with their poetry. So it's really people like William Blake expressed a very radical agenda that was not legally allowed through poetry, and had a great effect. So I think that's also very, very true, very true indeed. This podcast is a gesture almost towards writing. This is not writing, right? This is something else. And the fact of the matter is that podcasts, much more people listen to podcasts than read poetry. That is true. And there's a kind of poetry, like writing in general, but especially poetry, is niche. It is not very popular, generally speaking.
Yep.
And that's interesting. It certainly hasn't always been the case, but it is the case currently.
And we were talking about this, and we were saying how everybody who reads poetry also writes poetry, or a lot of people,
exactly,
and everybody who writes poetry sometimes doesn't read poetry even. So there's the kind of supply and demand with poetry is kind of very off. And isn't that interesting that, even contemporary poets very rarely read contemporary poetry. If we read poetry, usually I feel like it's older poetry. Obviously not everybody, and that puts you in a strange position as a literary magazine publishing contemporary poetry. And you're right, this is kind of also the reason why we wanted to make a podcast, because we think that it doesn't make sense to just say, oh, I wish people just love poetry more. You kind of have to present it in a way that people actually engage with things, and people don't usually go to a website and read a poem. That's not something that happens that much.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. But I do want to say, but there is a lot of people who like poetry, and people who like poetry generally really like it.
That is true.
It's, I think, also important.
Yeah.
And I think, poetry is, compared to a lot of things, very popular. Compared to, I don't know, probably a much more popular art form than, for example, weaving, or lots of other art forms. It still has, and it has a cultural role that is, if it were to not exist, would not be fillable. It is this kind of heightened speech, it can be prophetic, it can be deeply personal in a way that other art forms simply can't. It marks the average person engages with poetry, they will do so at a wedding, at a funeral, these kind of things. I don't know, often poets are commissioned to write poems for the openings of buildings, or these kind of things. Like, poetry has a kind of occasion marking ability within the social zeitgeist, and I think that's very important. That's the role, if we look at it descriptively. But prescriptively, I think poetry is also about its beauty, and it has a kind of aesthetic. There's nothing that, this is my personal opinion, it merges language with visuals, with music, all at once. It is a visual art form on the page, it is in the ear, and it's to do with words. There's the interaction of these three aspects that makes it truly unparalleled as an art form. And I think at its fundamental level, it exposes language. We've discussed there's so many ways that one can interpret the word witness. It exposes language, which is everything in this inside. Like, everything is language, so to speak. Like, we are kind of animals that fundamentally understand the world through language, and therefore poetry is the art form that is the most about language. And that can be very political, it can be very beautiful, it can be anything you could possibly imagine, but an art form that has language so fundamentally as its building block is very, very powerful, I think.
I agree with both of you, especially the part around supply and demand of poetry. So I am afraid that currently writers like poets are also primary consumers of poems. Um, but we do have instances where perhaps we have our parents or someone else reading out poetry just for the joy of it, and thinking about its addictive quality. I think right now with the way social media is working, and we are talking about young people. I think it would be rare to see a young person without any kind of interaction with social media. And I guess that kind of repetitive content and mundane ideas which keep repeating will exhaust us to some point. And I think this is the perfect time to introduce poetry because our attention spans, unfortunately, have gone down all over the world. And poetry provides like an elegant solution for the depth that people want. And also, it's in mini digestible packets that you could consume them. So this is what keeps me hopeful because I would hate to produce something which I don't feel has potential or would speak to people. But I think this is the right time, and the demand is more for authenticity and vulnerability, which we lack a lot. So in general society, other than spaces of creativity or literature. So I do feel very optimistic uh, about poetry. And I know in India we have excellent poets who are creating very good spaces for us to consume and write. Um, and the part that I love is they don't gatekeep, Like I find that I am in a poetry group, which is called Poetry Group Chill. So it was started by a poet called Kunjana Parashar. And we are essentially 100 or 150 competitors, right? If you would think in such a way, because um, somehow when it comes to access or I hate the term, but popularity, but I would say access, because not everyone gets that kind of voice or space, then essentially we are competing for very, small set of publications and such. But I find that generation, like the generation of poets here, Gen Z and later, are very kind to each other. And then I'm just talking about my own experience here. And the best part is that, you know, we convene for the joy of it, for the muse, and the other parts of being human, like, insecurity or certain not very savory parts, it's just not, doesn't exist in that group. So I hope that we continue to thrive there because it's a very fruitful space. It's a small space where all voices are respected, even if you're a mature poet or you're just starting out. And we share a lot of resources amongst us. Um, and I hope to share reading into culture very soon because that's how I found out about the magazine as well. It's through this group.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I remain largely optimistic about the future of poetry.
Oh, yeah.
But it's amazing. No, I'm optimistic too. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Sounds amazing.
I just again want to express my gratitude because I'm a very chatty poet, as you know. Usually, like poets have that mystery, and have that introverted quality, but not me. So I'm really truly grateful for providing this platform and for supporting these voices. And when you get feedback, I think it really helps. So this is something that I'll remember for the rest of my life because it's such a rewarding thing, right? It affirms that you wrote something, someone read it, and then like you've just created um something so beautiful, and it's like a way of connection, which is ultimately why I write. So thanks a lot, uh, Chris and Sarah.
Oh, that's really nice. No, thank you. It's thank you for submitting such a wonderful poem and allowing us to discuss it with you and having such interesting and insightful thoughts about that poem. And we're just a couple of fools. We're the one doing all the work.
So, would you like to read the poem one more time before we go?
Sure, thank you. So here's the witness. You notice her slogging, body worn by years of care. She looks like her mother now. You look like your father, with his likeness and afflictions. Born with beautiful eyes, you see words, the spaces between them, the lips, the gulps of lying throats, a naturalized soothsayer. Your brain is wine, older than the grape it was born from. The vintners like you. Time's done its cruel thing. It is, and it has, the weight of 3 people and a saint, their deeds and memories lining your womb. You decide to cull it gently. The best way to be is not. There will be no witnesses to this story.